Welcome everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly in all parts of the room. Welcome to this Sheldon Lecture, the second of two in this year, in 2025, presented by the Sheldon Memorial Trust as part of a continuing and happy association with the University of York's Open Lecture Programme, whose organisers we gratefully acknowledge. And Naomi Richardson was one of those, and she was here just a few minutes ago. It's also a pleasant duty to remind ourselves about the man who gives his name to the Sheldon Memorial Trust. And this has just become a little easier since the trustees took the radical and bold decision last week to adopt as the Trust's operating name the Oliver Sheldon Trust. And this is the first public announcement. Oliver Sheldon was a director of Rowntree's who in no more than 15 years in the middle of the last century played a crucial role in the founding or development of cultural institutions in York, notably the York Georgian Society and the York Civic Trust. But probably most importantly, was instrumental in laying the ground for what was ultimately to become the University of York. Sadly, he never saw the university, for it was not to open until 12 years after his early death at the age of 57 in 1951, and that was just 2 months after he had appeared as Lord Burlington in the Georgian Society's Great Georgian Ball in the newly restored Assembly Rooms that year. The Sheldon Memorial Trust was established 2 years later with the aim of promoting the study and understanding of York's history and arts. From the outset, it was envisaged that there should be a regular Sheldon Memorial Lecture, which brings us to today. This evening's lecture is around the 20th in the current series, launched in 2008, their biographical subjects being figures who have contributed significantly to the cultural, intellectual or economic life of York, mostly in the 20th century. Hitherto, however, all the subjects have been men, white men actually, with not a single woman, something about which we've been keenly aware and severely conscience-stricken. I'm delighted to announce, therefore, that this evening's lecture is our first focusing on a woman as the subject, namely Edna Annie Crichton, who was the first female Lord Mayor of York. This is thus a double first, enhanced by the fact that our speaker this evening is also female, Dr. Dorothy Nott, widely known as Notty. And we were delighted when Notty, who is one of our trustees, agreed to present this lecture. On retirement from a successful professional career, Notty tells me she went back to university, actually this university, studying the history of art, and eventually progressing to a doctorate. She enjoys visiting galleries and other art installations, art institutions, and giving the occasional talk. She is also a Minster guide. Notty is involved with many of the cultural associations in York. These include the Yorkshire Philosophical Society, which she represents on the Oliver Sheldon Trust, newly named Oliver Sheldon Trust, and the Friends of York Art Gallery, of which she was one time chair and is now on the events subcommittee. Notty became interested in civic history through 3 stints as York's under-sheriff, in which capacity she checked out the quality of beer sold at the assizes of ale, even though she tells me she's a non-beer drinker, and spent 1 day as Lady Mayoress, and I guess that was an important day, in Janet Looker's first year as Lord Mayor. Her interest has grown since becoming a guide at the Mansion House. Notty is thus familiar with the corridors of civic ceremonial, if not of civic power. We are much looking forward to your talk, Notty. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming our speaker.
Well, thank you, Richard. Thank you so much for that very warm welcome, everybody. I am absolutely delighted to be invited to give this lecture. As Richard has said, it is the first lecture in the Oliver Sheldon Trust's history to profile a woman, and that's after only 71 years. But this, of course, pales into insignificance when you consider how long it took York to elect its first Lady Lord Mayor, a mere 5.5 centuries, from 1389 to 1941. And then if you think about the very first mayor, Hugh de Selby, in 1213, even longer. So, as Edna herself said, thoughtful men and women should always represent members of all societies, and from that I suggest she means women as well as other marginalised groups. So, Edna was not a member of the York fraternity to begin with. She was born in Gloucestershire, and she was born into a very prominent Quaker family, the Sturge family. And I'm very pleased to see members of the Sturge family here tonight. So thank you very much for coming. She was the youngest of 4 siblings. She had a brother and 2 sisters. And her father, Joseph Marshall Sturge, was called a merchant cashier on her birth certificate. He was very prominent in shipping, corn, whale oil and pharmacy, along with the rest of the family, who were known for being radical and philanthropic. It was another Joseph Sturge, born at the end of the 18th century, who was also known as an abolitionist and a pacifist. And it was he who went all the way to Russia with another group of Quakers to try and dissuade the Tsar from entering into the Crimean War. He was not successful. However, he developed another interest. He thought he could prove that slavery was not necessary to work on plantations. And for that purpose, he traveled to Jamaica. And he subsequently put into practice his own theory by buying 2 plantations in Montserrat. And it was to Montserrat that Joseph Marshall Sturge, Edna's father, travelled with his brother, and where he met his prospective wife, Annie Burke. They were married in 1866. Annie was not a Quaker like Joseph, but she seems to have adopted Quaker values. And as a result of this, all 4 children were sent to Quaker schools. Charles went to the single-sex school at Leighton Park, whereas the 3 girls, Edna and Vida and May, sometimes called Mary, went to Sidcutt. And this is Sidcutt in Somerset, in the heart of the Mendips. And I have to declare a personal interest here, because this is my own alma mater. I had no idea before I started looking into Edna, so it was a wonderful surprise. Edna seems to have been the most sporty of the 3 girls, whilst Vida was obviously the more literary. She made many contributions to Sidcutt Quarterly magazine, and she scored a first in her English diploma. Vida and May went on to study at the Mount, but for some reason not Edna. David Rubenstein, in his homage to Edna, puts this down to the fact that Edna had failed her mathematics. I have to say that's another coincidence. I didn't actually fail, but it was a struggle. So she left in 1892. Although May says that the Sturge wealth had disappeared, it's very clear that Edna had an extremely comfortable middle-class childhood, spending summer holidays with her cousins, a tribe of cousins, at her grandfather's house overlooking the Severn, where May says there were only 3 indoor maids, and for the extent of the grasslands, stables, garden, etc. This was greatly understaffed, and where they enjoyed for their luncheon roast peacock. And their minds were filled with stories of Edward Burne-Jones, William Morris, and Rudyard Kipling. What happened in 1892 after Edna left Sidcutt is not terribly well detailed. However, we do know, again from May, that she and Edna travelled to the East End of London, where they went to the Passmore Edwards settlement to work. This is now the Mary Ward settlement. And it's probably because of that that she came across a certain David Sprunt Crichton, who was working as a sub-warden at the Mansfield settlement nearby. They were married in 1901 in Childbury in Gloucestershire, and almost immediately relocated to York, as David had obtained a job as the first welfare officer at the Rowntree Cocoa Works. This must have suited Edna extremely well, because it enabled her to keep in contact with her Quaker roots and also to make contact with some of her cousins who lived in York. Frances, for example, was a master at Bootham, whilst Helen Winifred Sturge was a mistress at the Mount. And in fact, from 1902 to 1926, Winifred became one of the longest-serving headmistresses at the Mount. And then Winifred's sister, Millicent, was in charge of the junior section of the school. So it was truly a family affair. And then a childhood friend of Edna's, Bertha Spence Watson, went to the Mount, having relocated from Darlington, and went on to marry John Bowes Morell, ushering in a lifelong friendship between the two families. So when Edna came to York, that was 1901, and she can't have missed the fact that in that year there was a certain publication of great significance by Seabourn Rowntree. And already steeped in social work, this will have reactivated Edna's wish to return to some kind of public service. But I suspect this was somewhat delayed by the birth of her two children, firstly Vida in 1902 and then David in 1906. However, it was not long before she did become involved again, and by the second decade of the 20th century, she had become involved as a member of the National Health Insurance Committee in York, and also was on the Board of Guardians. The National Health Insurance Committee was set up as a result of legislation passed by the 1911 Liberal government. She also was very well aware that there was going to be a vote for women in general elections, and she and Almira Gray, who was a member of the Gray family from Gray's Court and the first woman JP in York, they set up the York Women Citizens Association, which was designed to help educate women into a new role in public life. However, it is fair to say that even before 1918, women were able to vote, but in local elections. And in 1869, legislation was passed to enable unmarried women ratepayers to vote in local elections. This was something that was extended to married women ratepayers in 1894. So presumably in between, they had to rely on their husband's vote. And then in 1907, it became easier for women to actually become elected in local elections. So, but unfortunately, the take-up was very poor. So when Edna put herself forward in 1919 as a prospective councillor for the Bootham ward, she was one of very few. She wanted to stand as an independent councillor, so she wanted to represent all parties and all classes. And at her adoption meeting in 1919, she set out her 3 priorities. These were housing, health, and education. The press reported that Mrs. Crichton had said that it had been authoritatively stated that 1,500 houses were required in the Town Hall area, whereas only 300 were being built, and she felt this was totally inadequate. As for health, she felt that a proper system of health should be developed, and that would be good for the city of York. And similarly with education, where she felt that women in particular would have a lot to say. She was proposed by Mrs. Scaife and seconded by Miss Young and supported by a Mr. Crossland, who said that he thought there should be more representation of women on the council. On election night, Edna topped the poll, and she became independent councillor for the Bootham ward, a position as councillor that she held until 1955. And although her wish was that women should be equally represented on the council, she was joined by only one other woman, Harriet Fawcett, who remained for a mere 2 years. And in fact, between 1919 and 1938, only 5 women were elected to York City Council. So, Edna, as A.G. Watson and J.B. Morrell said in How York Governs Itself, there was already a shortage of housing in York at the beginning of the 20th century. And between 1914 and 1919, there was scarcely a house built, partly because of the war, partly because of the lack of funds, and partly because of the shortage of labour. So Edna soon found herself on the housing committee because at that time the government passed legislation requiring councils to assess the need for housing in their area and to meet that need. And by December 1920, Edna was already finding herself standing in as chair for the Housing, Rents and Tenants Subcommittee. Sadly for Edna, there was a terrible event in her life because her husband, David Crichton, unexpectedly died of influenza, put down by May to war strains. Now, David Crichton had been extremely well respected, not just by his employers Rowntree's, but by the city at large. And as David Rubenstein says, there was scarcely a sport in York in which David Crichton was not involved. But more than that, he was involved mainly through Rowntree's with drama, choirs, and other activities, and he also started the Cocoa Works magazine in 1902, which was the in-house journal of the Rowntree Cocoa Works. Although he was not a Quaker himself, he was an attender, and he was accorded a Quaker memorial, at which Seaborn Rowntree said, "Scarcely has there been such a sincere and spontaneous expression of love, respect, and affection for someone who gave so much to the city." The Archbishop Cosmo Lang and the Duke of York, the future King George VI, sent their condolences, and the Lord Mayor, William Birch, raised a motion in council expressing to Mrs. Councillor Crichton their sincere sympathy on the death of Mr. Crichton, who was so well respected and for whom they wished to record their own sincere regrets. Edna responded that it was really nice to have reassurance that her husband's value was remembered. Life must have been very hard for Edna, with 2 children and as a widow, and still carrying on in the council. She remained in St Mary's, where she and her husband had lived, but she decided to rent this out as a boarding house while staying in part of it herself. It must have been of some satisfaction to her, though, to know some years later that David Crichton had not been forgotten, and his name was used in the naming of a new street. This is the street at the end of Burtonstone Lane leading to the railway bridge. And so it's not named after Edna, as quite a few people might think. Now, work on the council was not confined to housing, and Edna soon found herself back in harness, both on the council, on the housing committee, but also on the health committee, where she stayed for the rest of her time as a councillor. And she was also involved in the education committee, where she stayed for rather lesser time. But this was very poignant because her husband had also been on the education committee, and where there had been a separate meeting to record their sincere regrets and their esteem for her late husband. Edna was not always successful in her proposals on the Education Committee, and on one occasion she put forward the proposal that the full deficit of educating the boys at Archbishop Holgate's should be met by the council. She was roundly defeated. But it was with the Housing Committee that she really made her mark. As chair of the Housing, Rents and Tenants Subcommittee, she asked the main council to provide temporary accommodation for those who had TB, those who were in very badly overcrowded accommodation, and those who were in houses that were condemned and had little resources. And she also, in a move strangely preempting Margaret Thatcher, but from a very different perspective, she requested that a letter be sent to tenants asking if they would like to buy their houses. Now, about this time, 1926, Edna became a councillor for Clifton. This was because the wards had expanded, and at the same time, she actually moved to number 30 Clifton, and this is where the plaque has been annexed. As you can see, this is a Georgian property, and it is quite a large house, and so Edna rented quite a lot of it out, whilst at the same time keeping financial interest in the St Mary's property. So she was a very astute businesswoman. Now, around this time, the council was giving much thought to the expansion of the Tang Hall estate, and it was able to purchase 173 acres from the ecclesiastical commissioners and a further 288 from the Crown, which enabled it to put out contracts for 185 houses on the estate. And then, with further legislation, they were able to build a further 28 houses under what is known as the Addison scheme. The Addison scheme was a landmark scheme which enabled councils to build houses for the working class with the government subsidy. And then further legislation gave the council more control, and they were able to build a further 128 houses on the Tang Hall estate. And at the same time, they purchased the Acomb Hall estate for private enterprise. In addition, 50 houses were built for sale with the help of a 5% deposit and a mortgage. And it was said that the layout on the Tang Hall estate was one of the best in the country. They even had indoor lavatories. By 1927, 1,280 houses had been built on the Tang Hall estate. But it became clear that this wasn't going to meet the needs of the very poorest in the city. They simply weren't able to afford the rent and rates. And just to give you some idea of the poverty at the time, in Bedham, there were, of 97 houses, 97 families there, 69 only had one room for all purposes, 18 2 rooms, and 13 3 rooms. And then at the same time, there was a development on the Hope Street area of Warmgate, and it was hoped that the cleared site would either be used for rehousing on the Town Hall estate or on the cleared site once it was redeveloped. By 1937, 4,000 houses had been built, and by 1939, over 5,000, at which point Seabourn Rowntree declared that all the worst slums that had existed in York since 1900 had been cleared, and this was since 1933 mainly, a time when Edna was now in the chair. 1939, of course, brought the war, and Edna immediately found herself on the Sites and Emergency Subcommittee dealing with the decontamination by poison gas at both Fishergate and Poppleton Road schools. There were many subcommittees spawned around this time, of which Edna found herself in the chair of at least 3, including the Billeting Committee, the Apparatus Committee, which was dealing with emergency kitchens, and the Feeding Committee, which was at which detailed consideration was given to whether or not the price of a fruit tart would be increased to 3d. It was. So on the 8th of September of 1941, it was proposed that Edna should become Lord Mayor for the ensuing mayoral year. And this was done without the aid of the usual committee, which was quite unusual for the time. Unfortunately, although it was accepted, unfortunately, the same month, Edna heard of the death of her son, David Sturge Crichton. Now, David had been very popular, he'd been very sporty like his father, and he had also played as a hockey international for Scotland. He had enlisted and he had been at Dunkirk, but he had not been successful in getting a boat back to England, so found himself in a German prisoner of war camp where he died. Edna received a letter from a fellow officer which said, "I have with great regret just received the news of the death of your son and my friend, Lieutenant David, truly a grand soldier." It must have seemed to Edna that all her municipal success was followed by personal tragedy. 2 months later, on the 10th of November 1941, the alderman William Birch and councillor Hargrave made a formal proposal that Edna, or rather councillor Mrs. Edna Crichton, widow of 30 Clifton in the city of York, be made Lord Mayor for the ensuing municipal year. And here she is in her mayoral robes with the mace and the cap of maintenance. This is a cap of maintenance that was given by George V, and we now have one given by Elizabeth II as well. And the robe that she's wearing there has now been replaced, but she looks very grand. And the press, of course, went wild. They said, Mrs. Crichton makes civic history, First Lady Lord Mayor in city's annals, whilst the Gazette said that this was rather a difficult time to take over, but it was probably a tribute to women's role in public life. However, it was felt that her faith, her Quaker faith, and her courage would stand her in good stead during her period of time. Well, as Lord Mayor, she was obviously ex officio member of all the committees, while still continuing to chair the Housing Committee. And she was also supposed to carry out lots of ceremonial duties, as well as being a JP. And just to give you some idea of the things that she did during that year, some of course that were linked to the war, such as saluting base warship week, and also rather more usual role for a Lord Mayor. And I'm glad to see we have at least one former Lady Lord Mayor in the audience, on the way to the Minster. And I want you to look at these photographs, because when you look at them, you see that here is Edna on her own. She's the only woman, and you have this group of men following her. I did wonder at one stage whether it was her Frida Harris, née Rowntree, who was her Lady Mayoress just behind, but I don't think so. So Edna's here on her own, and this was a very usual situation for her. But to say her year as Lord Mayor was dramatic is a complete understatement. On the 29th of April 1942, York was hit by an air raid. This was known as a Baedeker raid, Baedeker being the tourist guide for people to visit places of interest, historic towns and cities in Europe. And Hitler, knowing that Lübeck had been devastated by the British bombs, decided to have revenge on what he called Baedeker cities, including Norwich, Bath, Exeter, Canterbury and York. The planes arrived from Hull and followed the Ouse up to York to the station. And Edna from the Mansion House could see the Guildhall in flames. She then arranged for the control room to be relocated into the Mansion House, where it was said that she was calm, resourceful, and in charge of all operations. In all, there were 70 high explosive devices, magnesium flares, and incendiaries. When the all clear sounded, Edna immediately set out to go and visit all the bombed houses that she could. And in her sister's word, she was undeterred and unperturbed. And when she returned to the Mansion House later that day, she was met by Archbishop William Temple and Mrs. Temple, who were friends of hers and who had seen the flames from Bishopthorpe Palace and had come to see how she was. In the morning after the raid, York was on fire. Not just the Guildhall, we had St Martin's Coney Street, the Art Gallery, King's Manor, and vast swathes of Bootham, Clifton, Burtonstone Lane, Lehman Road and Poppleton Road. So this was a really very dramatic situation, and it was not only the Temples who were worried about Edna, because her sister May had visited the previous Christmas and spent Christmas at the Mansion House with Edna's grandson, Michael Hyam. And she realised how close the Guildhall and all these other places were to the Mansion House. And so when she went to the Oxfordshire Wireless Receiving Station the following morning to ask after her sister, she was told, "A killed Lord Mayor? Well, that would be news. We would certainly have heard of it." So it's hardly reassuring, but perhaps better than nothing. When Edna heard that the BBC had reported on the raid and had mentioned that the Minster had not been hit, she was incandescent. And she sent a telegram to the BBC criticising the editorial team for mentioning this, for fear that the Luftwaffe would come back and finish off the job. They didn't. So, according to the Evening Press, Edna was seen as an inspiration, spending 18 hours tirelessly superintending ARP stations, visiting the hospitals, the first aid posts, and generally alleviating distress wherever she could see it. They said, "We are proud of her courage and the calm summing up of the situation, which she could see from the Mansion House." They were also very appreciative of the relief fund that she set up, so that, in Edna's word, no one should be unbefriended. Sheriff, Councillor Oliver, was very impressed. He too was involved in looking after victims, but he noted that as well as doing that, Edna still gave time for her normal council work late into the evening, whilst her fellow Clifton councillor, H.E. Harrowell, remarked that there was one individual in York who should not go unmentioned for her sterling work during the raid, and that is the Lord Mayor. As it happened, the MP for Bradford, Sir Eugene Ramsden, was also in York at the time. He had been in the station on the bombed train, but luckily had survived without any ill effect. And he and Edna went out the following morning to check on all the damaged houses, including Edna's own house, which had suffered from damage as well. But her efforts were not, during her mayoral year, were not just limited to the war, although it can be seen from this next slide, the devastation that she had to cope with. And I just want you to have a look. I don't know if you can see, but can you see that there? That is Edna, this tiny woman amongst all these men in the procession on the opening of the summer assizes. And it's wonderful to see just how little she was compared to all the rest of the men who were parading in front of her. And as I say, this is her usual situation. But she was also involved in other activities, some related to the war. For example, making camouflage, where there are some women, and then hosting an Anglo-American friendship lunch, an austerity lunch. And you note the date, this is the very day of the raid. So this was just before that evening that we've been talking about. And then this must have given her great pleasure. This was a reception for Yves Mahe. For those of you who don't know who Yves Mahe was, he was the French pilot who heard about the raid in York and came to its rescue because he liked York very much. And he now has a plaque by St. Martin's in Coney Street, thanks to some school children, I understand. And then there were rather more usual events. I love this one. She's obviously putting her heart and soul into being Lord Mayor and enjoying the time. But again, she's the only woman. And then meeting York City Football Club. Don't expect there to be women there, really. And then the Poultry Association members. But it's rather lovely, isn't it? She didn't forget her association with women either. And she is here hosting the National Council of Women meeting in the Mansion House. Now, she seems to have had quite a good relationship with the Princess Royal during her mayoral year, because she met her on a number of occasions, both formally, as here, at the ATS service, and informally here. And I think this is a rather nice photo because it's only 3 days after the raid on the 2nd of May. And here they are chatting with the children, which is really rather lovely. And I'm very grateful to York Explore for Archives for all these wonderful black and white photographs that they've allowed me to use today. Now, she also did a rather wonderful thing, because it must have given her great pleasure to do this too, broadcasting to Canada from York, from the top of the Mansion House, with a wonderful view of the unharmed Minster behind her. Now, in that year, she was also lucky enough to give her friend, Archbishop William Temple, the freedom of the city. And she was very pleased to do this, recalling that he and Mrs. Temple had come to see her, to check on her after the raid, and also because she felt that he was a great friend to women and felt that all the women of York should rejoice in him receiving the freedom of the city. So that was a real pleasure for her. But even before the raid, Edna had been involved not just with war effort, but also she had been on the committee of the York Civic Committee set up by J.B. Morrell, and of which J.B. Morrell was chair. And this was in April 1942, so a huge amount of things were happening around there. And at this committee, it was proposed that a certain Oliver Sheldon should be co-opted to the committee. So it's rather nice to mention him today. And it comes as no surprise as well to see that Edna was also a contributor to How York Governs Itself, J.B. Morrell's publication of 1928. Now, after the raid, obviously a lot of people had lost their properties, and so rent was suspended for those whose houses were demolished and reduced for those where they were damaged. And of course, the empty houses were repurposed to rehouse the homeless. Now, of 981 applicants, from April after the raid, the end of April, to September 1942, there were 981 successful applicants for help, for rehousing or for rents being reduced, leaving only 38, which is remarkable that they managed to do that in just over 4 months during the war. So they really, she really put her back into it. So the end of her mayoral year came in November 1942, and at which point Edna achieved another first, because she became the first woman alderman on the death of Alderman Inglis, and she was proposed to be his successor. And she subsequently gave her aldermanic robes to the Castle Museum as a memento of her time as the First Lady Lord Mayor. She continued on the Housing Committee and continued to chair it, and she was also sent off in 1943 as the delegate to the National Housing and Town Planning Conference in London, when they were hoping that she would bring back ideas for more redevelopment in York, because it was found, especially at that time, that there were loads of houses to be built, and they estimated about 5,000 would be needed to cope with those that had been destroyed in the raid and general housing needs. And at this point in time, Edna found herself yet again the sole female representative on the council. Now, rather sadly for Edna, following the Labour victory in 1945, she found herself ousted as chair of the Housing Committee in 1946. And although Councillor Palliser made a very moving statement of how effective she had been and how he hoped she would continue to give the Housing Committee the benefit of her advice, she complained that this showed a mean party spirit. However, she did remain on the council and on the Housing Committee, and her attention was soon diverted because in 1947 there was a question about who should be the next Lord Mayor. Labour Party had put forward Councillor William Dobbie, and that was fine, except that he was also MP for Rotherham at the time, so there was some concern as to whether he would be able to carry out both roles. So an alternative proposal was put forward, naming John Bowes Morrell. Now, Edna, as his friend, immediately snapped into action and said that he was an excellent citizen and he was the last person to put himself forward or to seek the limelight. The matter went to a vote, and it was left to the chairman to give the casting vote. Well, of course, the chairman was a member of the Labour Party, so Alderman Dobbie got the vote, and he was Lord Mayor for that year. And John Bowes Morrell had to wait for another 2 years before he became Lord Mayor again, at which point he appointed Edna as his deputy. 1949, change in council composition, Edna's back in the chair. And this was a time when they were thinking about the Festival of Britain, 1951, and it was proposed that there be festival flats built in Paragon Street, and you probably all know where that is. And by 1951, the flats were ready for their first occupants. But Edna's second stint as chair was not as happy as her first. As the 40s gave way to the 50s, she had become increasingly less progressive in her outlook. And she was beginning to doubt whether council housing was the right option, whether they should be building more council houses. And she felt that some were actually under-occupied. But it was her second proposal about equalised economic rents, which was a real problem. This met great opposition. It had been in the woodwork from about 1952, and by 1954, on the 3rd of May, there was a meeting at the council, and Edna was delayed by a second meeting of the Housing Committee, and she left into a very noisy crowd. The Tenants Association of York had got up a petition of some 7,000 votes, 7,000 names, opposing this proposal for rents, even though there were rebates to go alongside them. And they had hoped to present this petition to the council in person. That was denied by 29 votes to 12. And so there was this huge crowd of 500 people in St. Helens Square. And because of the delayed council meeting, they had to wait 90 minutes, and they were getting more and more angry as time went on. So when Edna and her fellow councillors emerged from the meetings, they were met with cries of Gestapo and Nazi Germany all over again, which must have been extremely hurtful to Edna, given her role in the air raid. And so she had to be escorted by the chief constable to her car in St. Helens Square. The crowd moved on to St. Sampson's Square, where they held a very loud meeting and ended up singing the red flag. Edna survived that meeting, but she lost the chair to Councillor Buckton in the same month, in about 3 weeks later. And she never regained it. And by 1955, she had decided to give up not just the Housing Committee, but the council itself. And it's at this point that she received yet another accolade, because she became not the first woman, but the second woman to receive the honorary freedom of the city. I do apologise for this image. It is a bit water damaged, so I hope you excuse that. But here she is receiving the scroll of the freedom of the city from the Lord Mayor, Fred Brown. And although she wasn't the first woman, she was the first woman commoner, because the only other woman was the Princess Royal. And at the same time, she received a box of cigarettes, box of cigarettes, which were her favourite cigarettes. So they obviously knew what she smoked. At the celebration, she was joined by her former Lady Mayoress, Frida Harris, by her family, by John Bowes Morell, and by the MP, Sir Harry Hilton Foster, and the Archbishop's sister. Don't know where the Archbishop was, but anyway. So this was a great accolade for Edna. And after this, she retired. She was nearly 80 by this point. She had survived her husband and her only son, and she was due to survive her only daughter by a year. She lived very quietly in her house in 30 Clifton, and she spent much of her time with her good friends John and Bertha Bowes Morell, playing chess amongst other things. And when Bertha died in 1959, she continued to see John Bowes Morell and went to his 90th birthday party in 1963 at the Merchant Taylors. And then in 1970, in the Grove nursing home, Edna died on the 5th of March from where she was recovering from a broken hip. Although she was a Quaker, she seems to have had the memorial at St. Olave's Church. And David Rubenstein said that he searched high and low to see if there was any evidence of a Quaker memorial as well. But he didn't find any evidence, and neither have I thus far. So it seems rather strange that her husband should have the memorial when he was an attender, and she should not when she was a committed Quaker. However, she did receive a lot of accolades. The evening press was fulsome in its praise, setting out her many achievements as a social worker and a leader in the original Women Citizens Association, her time as chair of the Housing Committee, and her time as Lord Mayor, citing her as Mother of the Council in 1950, which I think is a rather nice title for her. And then the current Lord Mayor, the then Lord Mayor, Richard Scoresby, he said that he had known Edna when he was a young boy, and he had regarded her as a shining example of what women could do in public service. And he referred to her as a little woman with the heart of a lion. And when she died, she was cremated, and her ashes were scattered on her husband's grave at the Quaker Memorial Ground in the Retreat. And as you can see, all these gravestones are identical. And I haven't taken one of the actual gravestone, but this gives you some idea of where Edna lies. So, did she leave a legacy? Well, I think she did. She was not the first Lady Lord Mayor. That honour went to Ethel Mary Coleman in Norwich in 1910. Coleman mustard family. And then it took another 20 years for York to repeat the experiment with Ivy Whiteman. And interestingly, it is this image, this portrait of Ivy Whiteman that hangs in the Mansion House, not one of Edna, which you might think would be more appropriate. And this was done by a woman, Phyllis May Renette James. And we had to wait then until 1968 for Mona May Armitage, 1985 for Marjorie Boyer, and 1993 for Anne Reid. But since then, there have been a number of Lady Lord Mayors, I'm pleased to say, and when the Civic Trust came to place a plaque on the house at 30 Clifton, it was one of our members today, Barbara Boyce, who was then Lord Mayor, unveiling the plaque for the Civic Trust and as Lord Mayor of the City of York. And I'm pleased to say that she chose the opportunity to invite 3 other Lady Lord Mayors, all named Janet, to join her. One of whom, Janet Looker, became the first woman to be Lord Mayor 3 times, and also became an alderman in 2024. Janet says this is her favourite photograph and says she's sorry she can't come tonight to see it, but she's suffering from a rather bad cold and didn't want to pass it round. So we have quite a lot of Lady Lord Mayors, and it's no longer an unusual thing to happen. So when asking the current owners of number 30 Clifton permission to photograph their house and the plaque, I was met by great enthusiasm and desire to know more about this remarkable lady. And while Edna might not have had a road named after her, I did come across a rumour that there was a room in West offices, council offices, named after her. Well, I made numerous inquiries only to find this was not the case. So if there was ever a room there named after her, it's no longer there. But speaking with my own councillor, we think that perhaps there should be one after all, there is one for Hugh de Selby, who nobody knows about, who was the first mayor in 1213. So, who knows, we might get up a petition for her. However, there is, rather interestingly, a sword stand in York Minster. I don't know if anybody's noticed this before, but this is behind the lectern in the nave. And this was given to the Minster after the demolition of St John's Micklegate in around 1941, at the time when Edna was Lord Mayor. And the Friends of York Minster decided that the blank space at the bottom, because there were only 3 names of 18th century Lord Mayors on it, should be filled with the name of Edna Crichton. I'm really sorry I can't get a better photograph, but that gilt bit won't move. But you can make out that it is Mrs. Crichton, Lord Mayor 41 to 42, and they said they were delighted to be able to put her name on it as Lady Lord Mayor for that year, and the first Lady Lord Mayor, and a friend to the Minster. Now, I think that Edna was amongst those who assisted Almira Gray when she was raising funds for the only national memorial to women celebrating the First World War, which is the Five Sisters window. And Almira Gray and Helen Little set up a fund and asked women to contribute. Now, I have looked into all the archives, and so far I cannot find her name anywhere, but I'm pretty sure that as a friend of Almira Gray, that Edna would certainly have contributed to that. So, since Edna's success, we have had all sorts of women who have been making firsts. And actually, when they did the refurbishment of the Mansion House recently, they had this image of Edna on the front of the hoardings. And as you can see, it's got that quotation about a little woman with the heart of a lion. And alongside it, many of the other women who have made an impact. So we have the first MP, Rachel Maskell, in 2015, the first Lady Sheriff, Sue Cook, in 1992. We have Delma Tomlin, the first woman governor of the Merchant Venturers, Claire Douglas, first woman leader of York City Council, Jenny Bartram, first woman president of the Yorkshire Law Society, and a host of others. You only have to read her story to see how many have made an impact on York. However, rather disappointingly, when I spoke to both Janet Looker and Barbara Boyce about whether or not she had been an influence on them before they became Lord Mayor, the result was a little bit disappointing because it appears that she didn't. However, Barbara did tell me that when she was at school, Ivy Whiteman came to visit, and she went home excitedly to tell her family that she'd been visited by the Lord Mayor, and it was a woman. So we have to think that, you know, history, or rather her story, speaks for itself. And the election of a woman as Lord Mayor no longer makes frontline news. And it's hard to dismiss Edna's contribution to that. And although full parity has not yet been achieved between men and women, we are at least getting there. So just to finish off, to show you some of the images of Edna. What a wonderful woman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dorothy, for a really enlightening, wonderful lecture. I knew some of that, but to have it put together so brilliantly and in such a fascinating story, I think is fantastic. And I am really proud to be here on this really magnificent occasion when this is the first time that we've had a female subject for the Sheldon Lecture, so I keep repeating that. It's very important. Anyway, but I think that was a wonderful lecture, and if anybody's got any questions or opinions or anything they'd like to ask about, we've got a few minutes before we adjourn for our drinks reception outside. So if anybody's got anything that they'd like to comment on, Gary will bring the microphone round. Thank you.
They have to repeat it.
Dorothy, you've done a lot of research and put together a wonderful lecture for us. I'm sure there are others who would like to see this in writing, and I wonder if you've got any plans to publish this work so it can continue to be an inspiration to those of us who are here and to the younger generation who may learn a lot from it.
Publication.
Her publication.
Can I answer, or partly on behalf of Dorothy, I don't want to take the words off her mouth, but up until now, many of our Sheldon lectures have actually been published, mostly in print form, but we are also now, thanks to Borthwick Institute and Gary Brannan, who's here, we are producing podcasts as well, so that's another possibility. But I do agree with you. I think it would be wonderful to see something that, you know, could be preserved and put in print so that in future possible Lady Lord Mayors will actually know about their forebears. They won't be ignorant of them. So I think that would be great.
Thank you.
To
Yes, I just think, you know, it's in the course of discussion at the moment, so we'll keep you posted, Marilyn.
Thank you, Nottie. That was extremely interesting.
Thank you.
If I remember rightly, you were talking about 1939 and preparations for the war, and there was a throwaway line about poison gas and Fishergate School, which I didn't understand, and it doesn't ring any bells at all.
About poison gas at Fishergate
yeah.
and Hobbleton Road Schools.
I don't know much more about it, I'm afraid, Margaret. I just know that this was an issue. And, I mean, I had heard about Poppleton Road School before, so it was just kind of in the ether, but I really don't know many details about it. Do you know anything more?
Did she make sure the children got
Well,
or something?
you see, the trouble with this subject is there's not much evidence. And, I mean, nobody seems to have written anything down. I looked through all the council minutes and there was nothing about that in it. It just said that there were committees and that she was on this committee. But there's very little else, I'm afraid. So if you find anything out, that would be lovely. But, yeah, we have to deal with what there is available.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk, Nottie. Can I just pick up on one thing you said? For somebody who doesn't know about it, what was the very controversial suggestion about rents that you mentioned that caused all the fuss and the fuss in St Helens Square, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds odd to us now, doesn't it? But they didn't want to have a special rent and rebate scheme because it was going to increase the cost of the rent. And they felt it should be maintained at the existing level. But what Edna said was they introduced this with a rebate scheme because otherwise they would have to have an increase all round of a much greater level. So really they were against their own best interests, really. And it was actually introduced eventually. But yes, I mean, it doesn't sound that controversial, does it now?
It doesn't, no.
Thanks very much, Nottie. That was really, really interesting. I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how the council operated before the Labour Party came in the 40s and when she was voted out. You know, because obviously as an independent, was it unusual that you had an independent as a chair of a committee? Or, you know, so many of her friends, I imagine, were Liberals.
You mean when she was ousted from chair?
Yeah, she was ousted, obviously, when the Labour group came in. But she'd been elected as chair for so long before that.
Before then, it was the Conservatives and the Lib Dems, or Liberals, and they supported her. So because she was an independent, they were quite happy for her to be in the chair. But I think the Labour Party was making a statement to say we're now in charge. I mean, you remember that 45 is when the Labour Party came in anyway, nationally. And I think it was really that. They were taking over the council and they wanted to have chairs on all committees. It wasn't just hers.
Anyone else? Well, I think it's time that we adjourned, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more discussion over the drinks outside, but thank you very much for coming. I hope you really enjoyed, and this has been a wonderful Sheldon lecture, and as I say, a historic occasion. I was actually there on the occasion in the Cambridge Union when women were permitted to attend for the first time in 1963, which I know sounds archaic now, but I feel this evening has been something of the same. But thank you so much for coming. Do continue to support the Sheldon Trust. Look out for our forthcoming events and lectures. We're always on the University Open Lectures website as well as on our own website. So please keep in touch. Come and enjoy having a drink. And I'd like to invite you to just give Dorothy another really rousing round of applause for what I think was a wonderful lecture.